If you ever visit Galway Cathedral, you will see 3 stained glass windows that have pride of place in that church. In the centre is Jesus Christ, and then on either side you have a stained glass window of John F. Kennedy, and on the other, Patrick Pearse. Now, I suppose the choice of those icons gives an indication of when this was built, the mid-1960s. But it also gives an indication into some of the impact that these figures had on Irish history. It was around 1912 that Patrick Pearse was beginning to be seen as a major figure on the Irish political stage. He was renowned as a great orator. He was also someone who had built up a great reputation as a schoolmaster, as a teacher, as an innovator, an educationalist who was developing a new method of teaching his students, of developing values in citizenship that people weren't getting elsewhere. And this was really a period when a lot of the organisations which later became closely associated with the rebellion of 1916 were developing. The 1916 Rising was famously dismissed by the British government as a Sinn Féin rebellion, a Sinn Féin plot. The irony is that Sinn Féin had nothing to do with the rebellion. Sinn Féin, under Arthur Griffith, had not been consulted, had not been involved in any way. But because Sinn Féin was so connected with the Irish Volunteers, and the Irish Volunteers were so connected with the Rising, the name was assigned to it, and the name stuck. And it actually had the effect of boosting the popularity of Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin meaning ourselves alone, taking its name from a phrase of Thomas Davis back in the 1840s, became the vehicle then through which the revolutionary movement developed politically after the Rising. And Arthur Griffith is a very interesting figure. He was a brilliant propagandist, he was a brilliant writer, but at this stage he was a monarchist. He advocated a dual monarchical system, similar to that which existed in Austria and Hungary. And he had some idea of an Irish crown connected to the British crown, and that in some way you could have separate parliaments and linked in some way through these crowns. He was a very effective figure. But yet, the Sinn Féin movement was in gradual decline, and then from 1910 on, in steep decline. In 1909, Sinn Féin had 100 branches across the country. It had 1,200 members. By 1916, Sinn Féin had 1 branch, and that was in Dublin. And its members were called dismissively Griffith's fleas. And yet by 1917, as we'll see, Sinn Féin branches were on the rise again, and soon there were thousands of them, with 100,000 members all across the country. So in a way, the 1916 Rising was good for Griffith. What was also good for Griffith was the fact that he was arrested after the Rising. And when he was thrown into a cell alongside the volunteers of 1916, they didn't want to have anything to do with him. They said, "Guards, you've made a mistake. He wasn't one of us. He wasn't fighting with us. He shouldn't be in here." And they replied, "Yes, but he's the one who has been inciting you." And there was a large degree of truth to that. It was his propaganda. It was his writing about Irish politics in this period, which in very many ways created an inescapable momentum towards that Rising. Another organisation which this time was involved in the Rising was the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But again, by 1916, they were a shell of an organisation. Their president, McCulloch, wasn't even consulted about the Rising. And they'd kind of lost their way as a violent force. It had been discovered that their own treasurer had been embezzling funds from the organisation. He had stolen £20,000. Now, you might expect that the IRB would have taken him away down some dark alleyway and administered some form of justice. But no, they let him live. They just kicked him out of the organisation and said, don't do that again. And the IRB was seen as a spent force, a fading force. And John Devoy, the old Féin, who was still active in New York, began to despair about what might happen, what could be done. And that was where Patrick Pearse came into the story. Because in 1915, at the end of June, one of the old Féinians died at the age of 84, Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. Now, he had had a very interesting career. He had been involved in the Féinians. He had attempted to organise an insurrection in Ireland in 1865, the one promised by James Stephens, had been unsuccessful, but had been identified by the British spies and arrested. And he was put on trial, found guilty and imprisoned. And eventually he was allowed leave once he gave a promise that he would go into exile, that he would never return to Ireland again. And so he went to the United States. And there he worked with the Féinians, trying to do everything that he could to liberate Ireland. He was involved in organising the bombing campaign of the 1880s, when terror was used to try and strike fear into the hearts of ordinary British people. And it actually made him enemies. And one day when he was in New York, walking down Broadway, he was shot. An English woman got a gun, knew that that was the route he took, and opened fire on him. He wasn't killed, but he was wounded. And the Féinians thought this was an assassination attempt. The British said, no, this was nothing to do with us. She was not an agent for us. She was someone who's insane. She was probably someone who was deeply upset about the bombing campaign in England. She was an English woman who probably took that very badly and didn't like O'Donovan Rossa raising funds for all of these campaigns in the United States. But O'Donovan Rossa continued. He recovered from his wounds. And he lived to the ripe old age of 84. And he died in June 1915. And they were going to have a regular funeral in Dublin. But John Devoy contacted Tom Clarke, who was a leading IRB figure in Dublin. And they said, it's very sad, terrible news. O'Donovan Rossa is dead. And the advice was given. Devoy had a brainwave. He hit upon a brilliant idea. He said, send the body back to Ireland. We will have a dramatic funeral in Dublin. And that's what happened. They had a huge event where the body lay in waiting. Thousands came to pay their respects to this great old Féinian, very much annoying the British, who said, this is one of our worst enemies. This was a terrorist. This is a terrible man. And they decided they would have him buried in Glasnevin Cemetery and give him a big send-off. So they needed an orator. They needed someone to give a rallying speech to inspire the generation living then to rise up. Now, this was 8 months before the 1916 Rising. This was as they were beginning their plans for it. They needed someone who was impressive. And who could they go to? Well, the only person with the reputation for oratory was Patrick Pearse. And so they went to him and asked him to deliver the graveside oration. And he said, well, what do you want? What should I say? And they said, Tom Clarke, who later became the first signatory on the proclamation, he said, make it hot as hell, throw discretion to the winds. In other words, this was the moment. This was when they could deliver an incendiary speech that would be printed on ballad, on pamphlets, on notes, on newspapers all around the country. This would lead the country into war. And I'm going to read from Patrick Pearse's speech because it is considered his greatest oration, and it is considered probably the most influential speech in Irish history in the 20th century, because it did succeed in its objectives. It drew links, it drew parallels between the past, between Tone and Emmet and Mitchell, Young Ireland and the Féinians and the IRB and that generation. And it called them, it urged them to rise up, to honour their memory and to do something, to justify, to honour them, to show that Ireland deserved to be free. And he began cautiously. He began by saying that it has been thought right, before we turn away from this place in which we have laid the mortal remains of O'Donovan Rossa, that one among us should, in the name of all, speak the praise of that valiant man, and endeavour to formulate the thought and the hope that are in us as we stand around this grave. And if there is anything that makes it fitting, then I, rather than another, I, rather than one of the grey-haired men who were young with him and shared in his labour and his suffering, should speak here, it is perhaps that I may be taken as speaking on behalf of a new generation that has been rebaptised in the Féin faith and that has accepted the responsibility of carrying out the Féin programme. I propose to you then that, here by the grave of this unrepentant Féin, we renew our baptismal vows. We pledge to Ireland our love, and we pledge to English rule in Ireland our hate. Life springs from death, and from the graves of patriot men and women spring living nations. The defenders of this realm have worked well in secret and in the open. They think that they have pacified Ireland. They think that they have purchased half of us and intimidated the other half. They think that they have foreseen everything, think that they have provided against everything. But the fools, the fools, the fools, they have left us our Féin dead. While Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. Those words became a rallying cry. Those words, just like Emmet's speech from the dock, served to inspire a new generation of revolutionaries. And so the road was set for the 1916 Rising. And Pearse brought his own views and his own perspective to this. Pearse had an almost messianic belief that one man's sacrifice, one man's death on the cross, could redeem all of the Irish people, could rescue them from the slavery with which they laboured under. And so he talked about how in his plays, like The Singer, he talked about how it was good for one man to die if he would die for all of Ireland. He said, one man can free a people as one man redeem the world. I will take no pike. I will go into battle with bare hands. I will stand up before the Gaul as Christ hung naked before men on the tree. And he shocked some people around him by saying that we may make mistakes in the beginning. We may shoot the wrong people, but bloodshed is a cleansing and a sanctifying thing. And that horrified people. How can you speak in that way? And you may think that the horrors of the First World War made Pearse realise that he was talking nonsense. But in fact, it confirmed for him that he was along the right road. 16 months into the war, he wrote this. The last 16 months have been the most glorious in the history of Europe. Heroism has come back to the earth. It is good for the world that such things should be done. The old heart of the earth needed to be warmed with the red wine of the battlefields. Such august homage was never offered to God as this, the homage of millions of lives given gladly for love of country. And to this is added the relevant gloss, Ireland has not known the exhilaration of war for over 100 years. The old heart of the earth needed to be warmed with the red wine of the battlefields. Now, with all of the horrors and carnage of the First World War, for someone to come out with that philosophy, well, James Connolly, the leader of the Irish Citizen Army, who was brought into the plans for the Rising, he was scathing about this view. He said, whoever thinks that is a blithering idiot. The world does not need that. Whoever thinks that is a fool. So you see a difference of perspective. Connolly, the realist, Pearse, the idealist. However, towards the end of the 1916 Rising, towards the end of Easter week, what happened was that Pearse was the one who was horrified by the bloodshed. He was horrified when he saw civilians being gunned down on the streets by the British, when he saw that people were getting caught in the crossfire. And he decided to surrender rather than see innocent lives being lost, rather than see blood being shed. And so Pearse, the rhetorician, the orator, believed in bloodshed being a sanctifying thing. But Pearse, the human being, he believed that it wasn't a good thing, that it was never going to solve anything. And so, as the Irish revolutionaries embarked on the road to 1916, they came to it bringing a range of ideas, a range of mindsets about whether this could actually succeed, the ultimate fantasy, or whether it would be an heroic protest that might inspire future generations. And as the road to 1916 was embarked upon, they realised that they were starting something that would eventually lead to the creation of the Irish Republic.